3 words. That's all it took. Not a press conference, not a prepared statement, just 3 words from the President of the United States. And suddenly every oil trader, every naval commander, and every shipping executive on the planet is holding their breath. If you want the full, carefully sourced picture of what's actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, and why those 3 words matter more than almost anything said in this conflict so far, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this with someone who's been trying to make sense of the headlines. On Monday, speaking with Axios, President Trump was asked how much longer he was willing to let diplomacy with Iran play out before returning to military action. His answer was blunt. Not much time. He followed it up by saying the United States remains in deep talks with Tehran, but that if those talks don't work out, the country goes back to very strong military action. Later that same day, aboard Air Force One, he added something worth sitting with, that the only reason Iran wants to meet at all is because the United States has been hitting them very hard. 3 words. Not much time. And behind those 3 words sits one of the most dangerous, least understood standoffs happening anywhere in the world right now, centered on a stretch of water only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The Strait of Hormuz, roughly a fifth, maybe more, of all the oil the entire planet consumes, normally passes through that gap between Iran and Oman. And for months now, that gap has been anything but normal. Let's walk through exactly how we got here. What's actually confirmed about the state of the strait right now, why Trump's ultimatum carries far more operational weight than a typical political soundbite, and what happens next, depending on which way this goes. To understand why 3 words from a president can move oil markets and put militaries on alert, you have to go back to where this specific chapter of the crisis actually started. In late February this year, the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran, striking its nuclear infrastructure, and in a move that shocked much of the world, killing Iran's supreme leader in the opening days of that campaign. Iran responded the way it had signaled for years it might, by turning its attention to the one piece of geography that gives it real leverage over the entire global economy, the Strait of Hormuz itself. It's worth pausing here, before going further, to understand exactly why this particular strip of water carries so much weight in the first place. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, forming the only sea route out of the Persian Gulf. Every tanker carrying crude oil, natural gas, and a long list of other commodities, including helium and fertilizer, out of major Gulf producers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq, has to pass through this single narrow channel to reach open ocean and, from there, the rest of the world. There is no alternate sea route around it. A handful of overland pipelines exist that can bypass the strait entirely, but their combined capacity covers only a small fraction of what normally moves by tanker. In practical terms, whoever can meaningfully threaten this waterway holds leverage over a share of the global economy far larger than their own country's actual size or military strength would otherwise suggest. Beginning in early March, Iranian forces declared the strait closed. Not metaphorically closed, actually closed, backed by warnings to shipping companies, attacks on merchant vessels, and the deliberate laying of naval mines across the waterway. Within weeks, daily transits through the strait, which had averaged somewhere around 138 ships a day before the war, collapsed to a small handful, sometimes as few as 5 vessels a day, according to monitoring from the UK's Maritime Trade Operations Centre. Most of those remaining ships were reportedly linked to China, one of the few buyers still willing to accept the risk. The economic shockwave was immediate and brutal. Brent crude, which had been trading in fairly ordinary territory before the war, spiked past $100 a barrel within days of the strait effectively closing, and at points climbed even higher as fears grew. Iran's own military command publicly warned the world should be prepared for oil at $200 a barrel if the situation kept deteriorating. War risk insurance for any vessel willing to attempt the crossing soared to levels shipping companies had never seen outside of an active declared war, which, functionally, this had become. Since then, this conflict has moved through a genuinely exhausting cycle of strikes, pauses, ultimatums, and fragile diplomatic openings, each one raising hopes that the strait might reopen, and each one, so far, falling short. Trump gave Iran a 10 to 15-day window back in February to reach a nuclear agreement, warning in his State of the Union address that the deadline was backed by force, telling Congress directly that he would never allow the world's leading sponsor of terrorism to possess a nuclear weapon. That window closed without a deal. In late March, he gave a much sharper 48-hour ultimatum specifically tied to reopening the strait, warning of severe consequences if Iran didn't comply. Iran didn't comply, not fully anyway, though it did begin limited talks with Oman about restoring some level of safe passage. Throughout this stretch, oil markets essentially became a live scoreboard for how seriously investors took each new deadline. Brent crude swung from under $70 a barrel during brief windows of optimism, past $140 during the worst stretches of open warfare, the highest level seen since 2008, and back down into the 80s and 90s whenever fresh talks appeared to be gaining traction. Each swing represented real money, real shipping decisions, and real anxiety rippling through economies that had nothing directly to do with the underlying dispute between Washington and Tehran. By April, the United States had gone further still, imposing a naval blockade on Iranian ports after an earlier ceasefire attempt collapsed, and ordering the Navy to destroy any Iranian vessels caught laying new mines in the strait. Through the following months, the pattern repeated itself again and again, brief periods of intense American and Israeli strikes on Iranian targets, followed by pauses meant to give diplomacy room to work, followed by fresh Iranian provocations that dragged the crisis right back to where it started. At one particularly tense point, Trump reportedly told interviewers he was seriously considering a far larger offensive than anything attempted so far, describing it as bigger than any previous round of strikes and saying preparations were essentially complete, while stressing that no final decision had actually been made yet. He also said publicly that Israel would be ready to join any renewed campaign within minutes if asked, underscoring just how tightly coordinated the American and Israeli positions have remained throughout this entire crisis. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because understanding exactly where things stand right now, not just the headline version, is exactly what the rest of this video is built around. So where do things actually stand today? As close to real-time as reliable reporting allows? As of the most recent confirmed reporting, the Strait remains in a state that even experienced maritime security analysts describe as difficult to fully verify. Insurers themselves have said openly that they can't confirm with certainty how many mines Iran actually laid, or exactly where they sit. One insurance industry expert put it about as honestly as anyone has, essentially admitting that nobody outside Iran's own military really knows for sure whether specific stretches of water are actually mined or not. Which means every ship attempting the crossing is, in a very real sense, gambling on incomplete information. Early reporting in March suggested Iran had placed around a dozen mines. By July, American officials were reportedly telling journalists that Iran itself may have lost track of some of the mines it laid, and may lack the technical capability to safely locate and remove all of them, which, if true, complicates any future reopening enormously, regardless of who ends up in charge of clearing the waterway. Think about what that actually means. Practically, even in a scenario where Iran and the United States reach a full political agreement tomorrow, and even where Iran genuinely wants to cooperate on reopening the strait, the physical mines themselves don't simply vanish the moment a deal gets signed. Someone still has to locate them, verify they're inert, or safely disarm them, and clear a channel wide enough and reliable enough that commercial shipping companies are willing to risk billion-dollar vessels and irreplaceable crews on the crossing. That's a technical, months-long undertaking layered on top of whatever political resolution eventually emerges, not a footnote to it. On July 26th, just 2 days before Trump's Axios interview, Iranian state media claimed a tanker had struck a mine in the strait after allegedly navigating outside Iran's designated transit zone. That happened even as Iran and Oman were reportedly making what both sides called progress in safety talks, aimed at restoring some predictability to the waterway. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed that, as of that weekend, there had been no change in the underlying status of maritime traffic, meaning the severe restrictions Iran imposed when it reclosed the strait in mid-July remained firmly in place. The State Department, for its part, has maintained a Level 3 travel advisory for neighboring Oman since late June, specifically citing the risk of drone and missile attacks connected to the broader conflict, along with significant disruption to commercial flights in the region. Here's a detail that deserves more attention than it's gotten. Earlier in July, Trump publicly stated the United States would essentially take over management of the strait itself, and suggested the U.S. should be compensated for providing that protection. Around the same time, Iran's own parliament reportedly moved to approve a plan to impose tolls on shipping through the strait and ban American and Israeli vessels outright. A direct challenge to the very idea that America, rather than Iran, controls access to this waterway. Two governments, at the same moment, publicly claiming the right to decide who gets to use one of the most important channels in global trade. That tension alone tells you almost everything about why this crisis has proven so difficult to resolve through pressure alone. Now let's talk about the military side of this honestly, because the picture here is more complicated and frankly more sobering than most coverage lets on. According to reporting from Axios, sources close to the matter say that Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of U.S. Central Command, actually recommended pausing the bombing campaign against Iran specifically because it had reached the limits of what continued strikes alone could realistically achieve. Read that carefully. After roughly 40 days of full-scale war and a further stretch of more limited, targeted strikes, the strait still had not reopened. That's not a talking point from either side of this debate. That's the assessment reportedly coming from the very commander overseeing American military operations in the region. It's worth sitting with why that assessment matters so much. Airstrikes are extremely good at destroying fixed targets, command centers, missile storage sites, radar installations, the kinds of things a targeting officer can circle on a map and confirm destroyed through satellite imagery afterward. Airstrikes are considerably less effective against a threat that's already been dispersed into the water itself, floating mines scattered across a wide, deep channel, small, fast boats that can scatter and hide the moment aircraft appear overhead, and a political will inside Tehran that so far hasn't been broken by sustained bombing, however damaging that bombing has been to Iran's broader military and economic capacity. You can destroy the systems that laid the mines without destroying the mines themselves, and until those mines are physically found and cleared, the strait remains functionally closed no matter how much of Iran's military infrastructure has been degraded elsewhere. This matters enormously for how you should interpret Trump's ultimatum. Not much time doesn't necessarily mean the United States has an obvious, clean military solution sitting ready to go the moment diplomacy fails. It may mean something closer to the opposite, that continued military pressure has hit a point of diminishing returns, that the economic and political cost of letting this crisis drag on is becoming harder to sustain by the day, and that the president is trying to force a resolution through the threat of resumed strikes precisely because the alternative, an open-ended standoff with no end date, has its own steep costs too. And those costs are genuinely enormous. Even during periods when a deal seemed close and prices eased somewhat as a result, analysts at firms like FGE, Nexant, ECA warned that a prolonged near closure of the strait could realistically push oil toward $150 to $200 a barrel, with severe knock-on effects for the global economy. Gas prices in the United States have reportedly climbed past $4 a gallon at points during this crisis. And even in scenarios where a ceasefire or memorandum of understanding gets signed, experts have cautioned that global energy flows would likely take months to fully recover, given the scale of disruption already baked into shipping schedules, insurance markets, and stockpiled inventories around the world. At one point this summer, more than 500 vessels were reportedly stuck waiting simply to exit the Gulf once conditions allowed, a backlog that alone would take weeks to clear even under ideal circumstances. That backlog number is worth sitting with for a moment because it illustrates something easy to miss in the day-to-day headlines. Even a full political resolution, signed and announced tomorrow, doesn't instantly restore normal oil flows the next morning. 500 vessels queued up outside a single strait represents an enormous, tangled logistical puzzle. Ships that need updated insurance coverage, crews that need to be reassured the route is genuinely safe, port schedules on both ends that need to be rebuilt from scratch, and mine clearance operations that have to physically verify the channel before any of those ships can safely move. The gap between a diplomatic breakthrough being announced and oil actually flowing normally again could easily stretch into months, which is exactly why oil markets have reacted so violently to each new round of hope and disappointment, rather than settling into calm confidence the moment talks appear to be going well. Quick pause here. Because if this kind of grounded, carefully sourced breakdown is exactly what you come to this channel for, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. It genuinely helps more people find breakdowns like this one instead of just the loudest headline of the day. Let's talk about the diplomatic track, because it's honestly the most fragile and most consequential part of this entire story right now. Oman has spent months quietly working as the primary back channel between Washington and Tehran, hosting meetings at the deputy foreign minister level, along with technical specialists from both sides, specifically focused on restoring some kind of safe, predictable passage through the strait. Back in April, officials from both countries reportedly met to explore options for restoring safe navigation, with experts on each side putting forward a range of proposals to address the underlying situation. Iran has reportedly proposed a post-war maritime protocol with Oman that would let Iran play a significant role in managing vessel movement through the waterway, an arrangement the United States and Iran's Gulf neighbors are broadly seen as unlikely to accept, since it would functionally hand Tehran a degree of control over global shipping that no other single nation currently holds over any comparable choke point. Around that same period, an Iranian parliamentary committee reportedly voted to move forward with plans to impose tolls on ships using the strait and to formally ban American and Israeli vessels from using it at all, a step that, even as talks continued, signaled Tehran's clear intention to treat any eventual reopening as being on its own terms rather than anyone else's. At various points this year, momentum toward an actual agreement has seemed to build. In June, reports suggested a memorandum of understanding was close to being signed, one that would have had Iran, ending its near total closure of the strait in exchange for the United States lifting its naval blockade of Iranian ports, along with other concessions still not fully detailed publicly. Analysts at the time noted that even a full reopening under that kind of deal would only be a first step, since restoring genuine confidence in the safety of the route would still take considerable time on its own. That momentum collapsed. According to later reporting, the arrangement fell apart after Iran resumed attacks on cargo ships passing through the strait, which is precisely what prompted the current, more recent round of American strikes, and precisely what set up the ultimatum Trump delivered this week. It's worth being honest about the emotional whiplash built into this entire story, because that whiplash is itself part of the strategic picture. Markets have rallied on rumors of progress, only to sell off again days or even hours later when talks stalled or a new attack occurred. Stock futures reportedly jumped over the past weekend on renewed hopes tied to fresh Hormuz talks, even as the underlying military and political situation remained genuinely unresolved. That pattern, hope, spike, collapse, repeat, has played out often enough over the past several months that serious analysts have started treating each new round of optimism with real caution, waiting for actual ships moving through the strait in meaningful numbers before calling anything resolved. Let's talk about who else is watching this closely, because the Strait of Hormuz crisis has never really been a purely American-Iranian story, even though it often gets covered that way. Every major economy that imports oil through the Gulf has a direct stake in how this resolves. European governments have pushed for greater coordination on securing the route, with the United Kingdom at one point hosting talks involving dozens of countries, specifically focused on protecting shipping through the strait, while OPEC Plus members weighed whether increasing overall output elsewhere could offset even a fraction of the lost Gulf supply. Though most analysts agreed any such increase would take too long to meaningfully affect prices in the near term, Asian economies, particularly those heavily dependent on Gulf crude, have watched shipping schedules collapse and rebuild multiple times over the past several months, forced to scramble for alternative suppliers on short notice each time the strait tightened further. Gulf neighbors like Oman have had to balance genuine neutrality with the very real economic damage a prolonged closure inflicts on their own ports and economies, since much of the regional shipping infrastructure that supports Omani livelihoods depends directly on traffic through those same contested waters. None of these parties control the outcome directly, but all of them have real incentive to see some kind of stable arrangement emerge, whatever shape that arrangement ultimately takes. That's part of why this crisis, despite being centered on a bilateral standoff between Washington and Tehran, keeps drawing in voices and pressure from capitals that have no direct military stake in the conflict at all. When a single waterway can move oil prices in Tokyo, gas prices in Ohio, and shipping insurance rates in London all within the same trading session, the idea that this remains purely a two-country dispute stops making much practical sense. One more thing before we keep going, because if you've made it this far and you're genuinely following along, that tells me you actually care about understanding this properly rather than just catching headlines. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss the next update the moment something real changes on the ground. It's also worth remembering the human dimension sitting underneath all of these market numbers and diplomatic maneuvers. Real merchant crews have been killed or gone missing during this crisis. Real ships have been damaged, boarded, or abandoned entirely rather than risk the crossing. Real port workers in neighboring countries have been hurt in incidents connected to this broader standoff. Behind every oil price chart and every ultimatum delivered from behind a podium or into a pool camera, there are people whose jobs, safety, and daily lives depend on a strip of water that political leaders on both sides keep treating as a bargaining chip. Think about what it actually means to be a merchant sailor right now, deciding whether to accept an assignment on a tanker scheduled to transit these waters. War risk insurance premiums have climbed so high that some shipping companies have simply refused routes through the strait altogether, choosing instead to reroute vessels around the entire Arabian Peninsula, a journey that can add weeks and enormous fuel costs to a single voyage. Crews who do accept these assignments are often doing so for significantly higher hazard pay, fully aware that the waters beneath their ship may or may not contain mines. Nobody has been able to fully map. That's not an abstract geopolitical calculation for the people actually making that choice. It's a very real, very personal risk assessment made every time a ship prepares to enter those waters. So where does this actually leave us heading into the days ahead? A few things seem reasonably clear based on what's confirmed right now. The military option remains genuinely on the table, and Trump has been explicit that failed talks mean a return to what he's called very strong military action. At the same time, the country's own top military commander in the region has reportedly signaled that continued bombing alone has already reached the limits of what it can practically achieve, which suggests any renewed campaign would need a different theory of how it actually forces Iran to fully reopen the strait, not just repeat what's already been tried. That's a genuinely difficult problem for military planners, because the tools that work best against fixed infrastructure, aircraft, precision missiles, coordinated strike packages, aren't necessarily the tools that work best against a threat that's already scattered across an open channel of water and largely dependent on political will inside Tehran, rather than any single facility that can be targeted and destroyed. The diplomatic track through Oman remains active, fragile, and genuinely capable of producing a deal. But it has collapsed before, more than once, exactly when it seemed closest to succeeding. Each failed attempt has arguably made the next round of talks somewhat harder, since both sides now have a documented history of walking away or resuming attacks right at the moment. An agreement seemed within reach, which makes trust, already in short supply between these two governments, even harder to rebuild with each passing cycle. And the mines themselves, regardless of how negotiations go, represent a physical problem that doesn't simply disappear the moment a ceasefire gets signed. Clearing them safely and thoroughly is expected to take weeks at an absolute minimum, even under the best possible conditions, and considerably longer if Iran's own uncertainty about where all of its mines actually sit turns out to be accurate. What ties all of this together is the simple, uncomfortable fact that a strip of water 21 miles wide has managed to hold a meaningful share of the entire global economy hostage for months now, and neither overwhelming military force nor sustained diplomatic pressure has yet been enough, on its own, to fully resolve it. That's genuinely rare in modern geopolitics, a situation where the world's most powerful military and one of the most heavily sanctioned, isolated governments on Earth have essentially fought each other to a kind of exhausted stalemate over control of a single narrow channel. Before we wrap up, here's what I want from you. Tell me honestly in the comments what you think happens next. Does Iran actually cut a deal before Trump's patience runs out, or does this slide back into open military conflict within the next couple of weeks? And if you've made it this far, do one more thing, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of careful, sourced breakdown reach more people than the 30-second clips everyone else is scrolling past. Let's bring this together with where things actually stand right now, stated as plainly as the available reporting allows. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed or severely restricted since early March, following Iran's response to the U.S. and Israeli campaign that began in late February. Traffic through the strait, once averaging well over 100 ships a day, has at various points collapsed to single digits. Oil prices have swung wildly across this entire period, spiking past $100 a barrel multiple times, easing during moments of diplomatic hope, and remaining volatile as of this week. Iran and Oman continue working toward some version of a protocol to restore safe passage, while the United States and Iran's Gulf neighbors remain broadly unwilling to accept any arrangement that hands Tehran effective control over the waterway. Trump's own top regional commander has reportedly indicated that continued airstrikes alone have reached their practical limits. And on Monday, the President of the United States looked at a reporter and said, "The country has not much time left before returning to very strong military action." That's the picture as it stands today. Not a clean story with an obvious ending already written, but a genuinely uncertain moment where diplomacy and military pressure are both running out of runway at roughly the same time, and where the next move from either side could shift this crisis dramatically in either direction within days rather than weeks. It's also worth remembering, given everything walked through here, that certainty in a story like this is genuinely rare. Reporting on an active unfolding crisis inevitably involves details that shift, get revised, or turn out to be incomplete once more. Information becomes available, and that's exactly why phrases like reportedly and according to sources have shown up so often throughout this breakdown, rather than flat, unqualified statements of fact. That caution isn't hedging for its own sake, it's simply honest given how fluid this situation genuinely remains. This is the kind of story that doesn't resolve neatly on any predictable schedule, and it's exactly the kind of story worth watching closely rather than catching only in fragments, whatever happens next. Whether it's a genuine breakthrough in Muscat, a resumption of American and Israeli strikes, or another cycle of the same hope and disappointment that's defined this crisis since February, the underlying lesson here is worth holding on to long after this particular news cycle passes. A single narrow channel of water, barely wider than some rivers, has proven capable of holding a meaningful share of the entire global economy in suspense for months, resistant to both overwhelming military force and sustained diplomatic pressure alike. That's not a small thing to sit with, and it's exactly why 3 quiet words from a president, delivered without notes into a single camera, were enough to move markets and put commanders on alert within hours. Stay with this channel, because the moment there's something new and genuinely confirmed, whether that's a real breakthrough in the Oman talks or a resumption of strikes, I'll have it broken down for you the same way, carefully, honestly, without the noise. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. I'll see you in the next video.